Today, we're going to talk about why ChatGPT works as a product. And this idea sort of comes from a conversation that we were having internally about all of the non-machine learning components that make ChatGPT work, which actually includes a lot of elbow grease and different kinds of code that are not AI code, and actually a lot of product mindset thinking. So a lot of design practices, user experience understanding. And so it seemed like it was good timing to kind of put all of those pieces together. Before we actually dive into the kind of key reasons that I think that AI products either fail or succeed, I wanted to ask you about your experience with AI products. And so I picked out two AI products that I think most of us probably use fairly regularly. And my question to you, and you can put your answer in the chat, is which of these two AI products do you use most often? So I'll give you a little bit of time to think about this, and kind of look back maybe on your last, let's say, week, and think about which of these two, either Google search or ChatGPT, which of those you find yourself using the most in your day-to-day life. All right, so most people are still voting for Google search. Haven't seen anybody vote ChatGPT yet, but I think that in a couple of years that could change. And I think potentially a lot of people don't even see Google search as an AI product. So I think it's helpful to kind of put that into context. There are plenty of AI products that you are already using that sort of somehow magically work. And this is going to be a talk about kind of thinking about why those things do work. But I want to set some expectations to begin with. This is not going to be a talk about prompt engineering. I think that there's plenty of great content right now about how to get the best bang for the buck out of ChatGPT by doing additional prompt engineering. So this is not going to be a talk about that. It's not going to be about math. So I am a technical person. I'm a data scientist and a mathematician, but I'm not going to talk about that part. This is really just about kind of thinking about it as a solution. I'm not going to sell or pitch anything. And also, I didn't create ChatGPT. So this is all sort of coming from, given my experience, given kind of what I know goes into the making of these sorts of things, my best guess about kind of what we know and kind of just from doing some research into the product team that's responsible for ChatGPT. So this talk really is focused on what makes AI products and solutions either fail or succeed. And again, that's sort of based on my experience. I'm what they call a renegade PhD. So a renegade PhD is somebody who finishes their dissertation and graduates, but then immediately goes to industry. So I am one such renegade PhD. When I graduated, I entered the fledgling field that was starting to be called data science. This was in the early 2010s. And probably in that time, I've built maybe 24 AI solutions. And I'm proud that a very high proportion of them have been successful, so deployed, kind of generating value for their users. But I will say that the industry average, the industry standard for successful deployments of AI solutions is extremely low. So it's about 13% on average, the success rate of deployments. And so having a success rate that's higher than that is notable, but also, I think that we need to sort of socialize some of these fail points so that we can steer towards products that are more likely to succeed, because I think part of the reason that that failure percentage is so high is because people haven't really thought through the reasons that things fail. So I'm going to talk about those. So why do so many AI products fail to launch? Honestly, I think the number one reason for those failures, and I'm going to go through 8 reasons that I've kind of been able to deduce from what I've seen over the years. But the number one reason is that the solution is not boring enough. And I realize that this is a little bit counterintuitive because the kind of sentiment around AI and machine learning is that it should be sort of titillating and exciting in some way. But the reality is that those sort of titillating and exciting use cases are the ones that are most likely to fail in my experience. And here's why. So basically, there are a couple of things that can immediately disqualify an AI product. It's good to have this sort of mental checklist that I'm going to go through in your mind. The number one reason that we disqualify an AI product, that I've learned to disqualify products, is if there's not sufficient data. But what does that mean for a non-technical person? Basically, it means that the process is not well suited to automation because we haven't kept a record of how the people who have been doing this task have been doing it, right? So there's no record of the decisions that they've made. Maybe there's no record of the pieces of information that they use to help make their decision. If that's not recorded anywhere, it's extremely difficult or impossible to do automation, because what automation is you sort of look back at all of the decisions that people have made, and then you try to encode them into a model. So if there's no record of those decisions, there's sort of no place to start. That's honestly the number one disqualifier. But there are plenty of cases where it's impossible to do automation for some regulatory or legal or compliance reason. A lot of the time in my early career, when I was getting started with data science, I was working in the government, and I worked for a regulatory agency. And at that regulatory agency, there were a number of decisions that could not be made using algorithms. They had to be made by a person. And there were laws that constrained how those decisions were made. And so there are many cases like this where it's just a non-starter. You should not try to automate this thing because there's some clear blocker to doing that. But there's also a lot of gray area. And that's what I want to talk about here, this sort of gray area of places where humans feel sort of protective about a decision, where it's something that technically maybe there's records of them making that decision and they're stored somewhere and there's nothing prohibiting automation. But if people feel very protective about the task that they're doing, it's not going to be a very successful launch of the solution, even if you build it, because it's going to require a degree of culture change, and there's going to be a significant amount of resistance that is usually enough to kind of tank the solution, even if it's in theory a good solution. So, if you think about kind of here where ChatGPT really shines, right? ChatGPT is doing something that most people really dislike doing, which is writing. And there are people who love writing, but I would sort of, hazard a guess that most people don't really like writing things like emails or things like that. And probably ChatGPT doesn't actually write all of your emails for you, even if you are using ChatGPT, but it does something important. It solves that sort of blank page anxiety. A lot of people use it as sort of a starting point, and you get the generative text, and then maybe you modify it a little bit and you send that, right? So it's doing something very mundane, something boring, something that, for the most part, we don't feel very protective of, and we're happy to delegate that to an algorithm. And so that's something that you want to think about right at the beginning. Is this something that people are going to feel comfortable delegating, or am I going to have to do a lot of work to make people feel less protective? And maybe you don't want to climb that hill if it's going to be very hard. So here's another reason that AI products often fail, in my experience, is if the user experience is really poor, it doesn't matter how good the model is. So I found this comic recently, and it gave me this wave of memories from about 10 years ago when there was this huge proliferance of data dashboards. Everybody was sort of obsessed with the idea of materializing and showing all of their data to kind of support analytics and decision making. But I think that we can sort of agree that the kind of big data dashboard experiment of 5 or 10 years ago did not succeed because most of those dashboards have been abandoned. And I think that the reason is because the user experience is not there. So in this comic, the character is saying, after careful consideration of all 437 charts, graphs, and metrics, I've decided to give up. So probably some of you kind of relate to that experience. And I think that the issue here is that as technical people, we tend to make a few assumptions. And one of the assumptions is that the visualizations that make sense to us are going to make sense to everybody else. We also assume and are taught in science education, we're taught that presenting data as objectively as possible is what we're supposed to be doing. And so there's a tendency to kind of, really kind of show things and allow the user to draw their own conclusions. But I think that the reality is that what most people are sort of hoping for in a magic data dashboard is something that's a little bit more opinionated, right? Something that's kind of focusing your attention to something specific, potentially at the expense of something else. But that's really helping you kind of focus in and make kind of a specific decision. And as technical people, that oftentimes goes against our training and our instincts, and that can kind of lead to a very poor user experience. Another one is we sort of have this sense that the dashboard must show everything. If there's tons of data, then the dashboard needs to show all of that. And I think that all of us probably have a little bit of this idea that good AI will somehow overcome bad user experience. And I don't think that that's a safe assumption to make. So I want to do an experiment, and I want to ask you all to tell me in the chat what your immediate reaction is when you see when you're on a website and you see something like this pop up. So how does it make you feel when you see something like this pop up on a website? You let me know in the chat. So dismiss, avoid, close it, cringe. How do I close this? I think that, there's sort of a universal distaste for these kind of chatbots that are integrated into services and product websites. We don't like how this feels as users. And so I think then it's a little counterintuitive that something like ChatGPT would be so successful. So let's talk a little bit about what specifically is different about ChatGPT and why it's not the same thing as having a little chatbot that pops up in your web application. So I live in North Carolina. I'm trying to learn how to garden, and I'm trying to figure out how to get started. And so I asked ChatGPT to recommend some perennials that I should plant. And I think that one of the key things here is that as a user, being able to describe my question with human language makes for an excellent user interface because it's closest to how I actually think in words. It would be very different if I had to enter a query to get this result. And so there is something really nice about, as the seeker, as the person who has the question, to be able to ask that question in my human language. I think another key thing that ChatGPT does that's really significant is that they're hiding information, right? So the information about where this research comes from, where they've sort of aggregated these suggestions from, is not shown. I don't see kind of alternate answers that ChatGPT could have come up with, because statistically there's probably about 25 different answers, that would be equally good. I don't have that that look into it. It's just giving me one answer. It's summarizing. It's not giving me, hundreds of options. It's giving me kind of a short list. And those practices of summarization and information hiding are particularly important with AI because there is so much information under the hood, right? You don't want to show everything. And that's, I think, one of the reasons why ChatGPT is so effective as a product. So reason number 3 is, one of the things that I've seen a lot is that, we end up with a model that doesn't really understand who it's for. And I think that that's actually extremely common as product people. I imagine that this is kind of one of the number one things that people out there are grappling with. I want to talk about, why it is with AI products in particular that this might be more common to like not know who the user is. So the number one thing is that data science is strongly influenced by the academic tradition. A lot of the initial data scientists were coming from academia and didn't really have any training in business, weren't kind of attuned to business processes or business ways of thinking. And that's still holdover, that kind of holdover of these academic research traditions is still true. And it'll go away progressively because I think we need the business side too, obviously, in order to build solutions. But that's not, you shouldn't sort of assume that that's already kind of baked into data science. Another thing that probably you have noticed is that your engineers, as smart as they are, may not be especially attuned to the business processes at your organization. And so they might not think to encode things about those business processes, even if they're very obvious things. They might not think to encode those or even be aware of those into the product. And so this can also kind of contribute to some problems, especially if, as a product owner, you aren't thinking about things like usage tracking, like how is this AI solution being used, who is using it, how are they using it? If you don't think about those kinds of tracking things until kind of the end, it's hard then to do that retroactively. And what you end up with is maybe A/B testing, right? To sort of evaluate, is this version better or is this version better? But it's sort of an afterthought. And here ChatGPT and OpenAI have done something very interesting. So they have the same problem as all of us, right? They don't know who their ICP is. They don't know who their ideal customer is. And you can tell that from the initial interface, right? It's offering a lot of very different options for how you can engage with ChatGPT, for anything from make me a sandwich to help me schedule my vacation, right? Those are two kind of totally different users, and they don't know who their user is, right? But one of the unique things here with how they've implemented the solution is that under the hood, there is a model that is learning how people are actually using the interface and sort of changing it subtly over time. And so what they have figured out how to do is delegate some of their customer discovery process to a model. It's not the same model that is doing the text generation. It's a different model. But it's a machine learning model that is learning from the behaviors of the user. And so over time, it will sort of subtly become more lovable because it will be presenting things that are being engaged with more. Okay, reason number 4. And this is for all of those people out there who are dealing with cybersecurity issues, data privacy, healthcare, kind of cases where the data that you're working with is very controlled, needs to be kept secure and private. And I think that when you are coming from that perspective, the idea of automation is really scary. And the truth is that you should be scared. Totally legitimate fears. These are 12 of the key risks of AI as reported by the National Institutes of Standard and Technology. And it goes from everything from sort of what you'd expect, like things like students plagiarizing papers, to things like, hacking, supply chain vulnerabilities, global warming. All of these models are sort of heating the planet up. So radicalization. So these are all documented, real concerns of the United States government of AI. And the reality is that, we should be thinking about these. We should be a little bit scared, and that's kind of the best way to implement safe and secure solutions, is to kind of go in with that understanding that there are going to be risks that we need to mitigate. So how did OpenAI deal with this problem? Well, they didn't, right? So they sort of decided to punt on dealing with the risks until later. And I'm not necessarily recommending that as a solution to those risks. In fact, I think it's not probably the best choice for most of us. But I do think that it is a big part of the reason why ChatGPT is commercially available now. Because if they had gone through all 12 of those possible risks and mitigated all of them before launch, they would not have launched yet. And so you have to kind of think about the risks that are most relevant to you and kind of make a plan to mitigate them, but you can't kind of just let fear sort of shut you down completely. So the next thing that I want to talk about, and this is kind of very close to home for, I think, a lot of us out here who are working at companies that have just gone through sort of a hyperscaling event. So let's say you do have something, you have something customer facing, or you have a good product, you have, something that your customers love, you have processes, maybe they're not scalable, maybe they're not, easy, but you have something that people love. But the reality is that how that looks from the internal perspective as an engineer is that everything is on fire. And the reason is that, if you've just gone through one of these hyperscaling events, there's a ton of technical debt that you're handling as an engineer. You're dealing with maintenance and fixing bugs, and you're in a lot of, kind of Scrum meetings, and you're writing documentation after the fact. You're hiring people, and it is really hard to think in sort of an innovative mindset when you're tired. There's this kind of popular meme that has gone around in sort of engineer Reddit that you may or may not have seen. But it's sort of this kind of rudimentary graphic of the senior developer interacting with the junior developer and kind of encouraging them to keep going, when what the junior developer doesn't see is that the senior developer is sort of getting hammered by missed deadlines and complaints and stuff like that. And this is a very difficult context in which to innovate and automate with AI. And so how did OpenAI deal with this? Well, they basically just let a team of engineers start from scratch. And they gave them that sort of senior engineer who would be the one to get hit with all of the arrows. And that senior engineer is Evan Morikawa. He is the engineering manager of the applied team at OpenAI, and he sort of he's the one who's responsible for scaling the team from a tiny team of fewer than 10 to the team that they have now. But his solution to this was to just sort of let people start fresh, right? So you kind of forgive tech debt. Not exactly, right? Because we're not getting rid of the old code, but we're letting the engineers and data scientists start in a fresh repository. And that lets them kind of function like an early stage startup that's looking for a product market fit. All right, so speaking of the engineering team, another one of the key reasons, and this might be kind of one of the more common ones, is this problem of throwing the model over the wall. So I'm not sure if that's a phrase that you are familiar with, or that you've heard of before, but the reality is that when you are sort of outside of the technical team, I think that it can be easy to imagine that the engineering team and the data science team sort of are naturally have compatible cultures and practices, but that is not true. It feels more like two groups who are trying to talk to each other across a wall. Does anybody know what this picture is, by the way? You can, if you if you recognize this picture, feel free to identify what we're looking at here in the chat. So nobody's suggested anything yet. Yes, it's the Berlin Wall, right? So, this was obviously a long time ago, but, when you have a wall up between two cultures for a very long time, even bringing down that wall doesn't necessarily mean that the two cultures will automatically become collaborative and be able to work together. At almost every company that I have worked at, the research or data science and engineering teams have had totally separate cultures. And what this looks like is that a lot of places, like maybe the data science team reports to the business side and the engineering team reports to the CTO. Or maybe they all work together, but the engineers are using kind of a traditional, agile or Scrum approach, and the research team is doing something more like Kanban. And, those practices really do contribute to this practice of throwing models over the wall, which looks like, the research team, the data scientists training and developing models, and then not knowing how to deploy them, or not having, authority to deploy them. And so kind of just handing or throwing the model over the wall to the engineering team with the assumption that the engineers will be able to kind of straightforwardly deploy it into production. This does not work. It's sort of documented that this does not work as a model. And it's for a lot of different reasons, but basically you really have to understand how the model was architected in order to know how to deploy it. I think a lot of people are trying to address this problem now using sort of ML ops as the path towards solution. But I don't think that that's really enough to kind of solve the culture part. And so I guess I'm just pointing out that there's sort of these kind of small cultural practices, things like stand-up meetings, things like opening pull requests, things like using the same version control tools, things that will kind of align these two cultures and make it a lot easier for them to collaborate than is true at most companies. And that is essentially what OpenAI did. And so Evan's team is this kind of sub-team inside of this bigger OpenAI team. And what they have done is that they've explicitly hired onto this, what they call it the applied team. This is the team that builds ChatGPT and maintains ChatGPT. This applied team has a critical combination of 4 abilities and skills. So they have engineers, and they have the researchers together, and they also have the designers and the product people, and all of them are together on one team, and Evan oversees this team. And it's really interesting, to hear him sort of talk about this. Comes from an interview that Evan did with a website called The Pragmatic Engineer. And what he says is that they made this observation that most product questions are actually research questions, so that there is some research needed in order to decide how to answer these product questions. And so it just made sense to integrate them. And probably some level of integration makes sense for most companies. All right, reason number 7, there's one more after this, and then we'll take questions. So reason number 7 is that the model made mistakes. And this is a hard thing, I think, to talk about, because as humans, we know that everyone makes mistakes, so intuitively, that maybe the training data that's being used to train a model probably does include some mistakes that people have made in the past, and the model is going to learn those mistakes. But somehow, when we see our technologies make mistakes, it's deeply unsettling, right? It feels wrong when a machine causes some kind of error or makes a mistake. It's deeply unsettling. And I think that this is something that we don't talk about enough when we talk about AI solutions and AI products. And so I think it's really interesting to see what ChatGPT does here to deal with mistakes, because is ChatGPT perfect? Does it make mistakes? It is not perfect, and yes, it does make mistakes. In fact, it makes mistakes constantly, so often that the UI, if you look sort of at the bottom here, there's this disclaimer that's just standard now. ChatGPT can make mistakes. Consider checking important information. But there was a day a couple of months ago when many people sort of noticed that they were getting these really incoherent responses from ChatGPT. Incoherent, in the sense that it wasn't even sentences. It was totally illegible. And shortly after that, OpenAI posted an instant report about what happened, and they say, this happened on February 20th. There was a bug that was introduced. But I think that the key here is that they are acknowledging the errors in many ways. They're acknowledging the error with the disclaimer. They're acknowledging the error with this disclaimer. And there's this error that I'm sure some of you have seen, which is just the error that ChatGPT is at capacity. And they've kind of tried to, I think, lean into the idea that, you should have, this is a low stakes thing. You should not be too worried that it's not available, because they have this little, talk as a pirate kind of explanation about why the service is currently unavailable. And it's usually because there are too many concurrent users. And actually, we're going to talk about concurrent users in just a moment. But the reality is, these errors are common. And the main problem is if the errors are being made in an extremely high stakes decision-making situation, then we don't have a sense of humor about it. And that's another kind of, reminder to problem number one. You want to pick boring problems where if there is a mistake, it doesn't feel catastrophic. And so ideally, kind of picking mundane use cases will help alleviate this a little bit. But also, we need to make sure that we prepare the user for inevitable errors, right? So, and part of this is just a design problem, right? Like designing the user experience of an error is important. And we should think about that, because if people sort of are unsettled, then they might not come back. Okay. Here's the final reason that I've sort of observed in my career of why AI products fail to launch. And this is when we miss the forest for the tree. And I think that this is incredibly common, right? Because people get so excited about AI and machine learning, there is a tendency to really fixate on just the AI and machine learning component of an AI solution as a whole. And if you fixate all of your energy, people, money, resources, focus, time, requirements gathering, all of that to just the model, you are forgetting about a lot of other pieces of the overall solution that are critical to success. And so I want to give you kind of a glimpse into what that probably looks like at ChatGPT. So this is a, partial and mostly guesswork, but informed guesswork list of probably all of the non-AI parts of ChatGPT. So there's a front end, right? And it's probably React or Vue or something like that. There's a web service, right? Because it needs to be able to, when you log in and you type a question, there's a service that needs to kind of send your request somewhere and decide kind of which node is going to respond. So that involves a bunch of things like TLS certificates and hosting, WebSockets, which is really complicated. There's also just like an input-output logger, right? Because the system needs to log events so that it knows how to scale up and down. So there's probably, a lot of logging that's happening whenever you enter a question or get a response back. There is some kind of language chunking service. So what's happening when you put a whole sentence in is that there's some kind of service that's breaking that down into chunks and handling the chunks independently. And probably also with the output, there's some chunking. There are probably several abuse filters, right? So there's probably some kind of abuse classifier that is designed to identify, if the input text is abusive. There's probably, some heuristics too, like simple curse word lists that are no words that you can't use. There's probably even other classifiers, other kind of components, other machine learning components that maybe have learned over time that there are certain topics that ChatGPT should not respond to, like politics and religion and sex. So there are probably multiple abuse filters. There's obviously a massive training corpus, and what that requires is, vector databases and archives. So a lot of kind of archived documents in compressed file systems, which are stored somewhere. There's the model service that interacts with the model in order to deliver predictions. They have to bill people, right? So they have to count tokens, because the way that ChatGPT, the business model is that you're charged per, thousands of tokens. And so it has to figure out how to tag like usage events. So there's probably some kind of event database that captures usage events as they happen, so that they know how much to bill you. And for the DevOps folks out there, there's a bunch of Kubernetes probably happening under the hood, right? This is like very network intensive and bursty activity. It probably has on average maybe like 100,000 concurrent users, and that takes a lot of work. So there's lots of non-AI parts. And if you don't consider all of those, you don't really have a product, right? You just have a model, and a model is not a solution. If you are sort of interested in kind of delving into that part in particular, if you're kind of interested in exploring the other things that need to kind of come together in order to build kind of a complete AI system, we're actually doing a series specifically on AI systems. And it's going to kind of cover a lot of different angles. So not just the engineering parts, but also product and design, user experience, marketing, all of those kinds of pieces. If you're interested in that, I'd love to have you pre-register. Pre-registration is limited. I can't remember how many are allowed, but I think it's something like 40. So if that's something that you're interested in, you can use this QR code, scan it with your phone. It'll take you to a pre-registration link that you can use to kind of register your interest in joining us for this series. It's going to be kicking off, I think, late May, and it'll go for 4 months. And I think it's one webinar per month in the series. So we'd love to have you join if AI kind of solutions and systems implementation is something that you are currently working on. So let's quickly kind of review here the key 8 things, the key lessons here. Target something mundane. The more boring, the better. And take the user experience seriously. I'm always surprised that there isn't more kind of conversation about the UX of AI. I think that must be coming soon. I think that this is a very rich topic that we need to talk about more. I also encourage you to think about the customer discovery part, figuring out who the customer is, who the user of the model is. And this customer doesn't necessarily mean an external customer, right? This could mean just like something that you're building in-house to help your own team in some way. They're the customer then, kind of figuring out how to let the solution, have a little bit of independence in how it evolves to become increasingly more lovable to its users over time. Don't ignore the risks. Don't stick your head in the sand. These NIST, this list of 12 AI risks is easy to find. You'll get a link when in the slide deck when you get the slides after the talk. So don't ignore them. Consider which ones are relevant and work to mitigate them, just the way we do with all risks, right? If you can afford it, let your team start fresh. Let them start in a fresh repository. Let them have this sort of greenfield experience that Evan created for the applied team at OpenAI, so they don't feel this sort of burden of maintaining existing code if you really need them to innovate. And make sure that the right people are innovating together, right? That has to be research, engineering, product, and design together to some extent. Planning for the mistakes, right? Design that sort of error user experience so it doesn't feel so uncanny and uncomfortable when the inevitable errors do occur. And figure out how to delegate, right? So think about all of the non-AI parts of ChatGPT and kind of delegate the solution to different pieces, right? You don't need just one model to solve everything. You can have a lot of little pieces that come together that solve different parts of the problem. So as a sort of parting gift, we're going to give you a self-assessment, sort of a take-home assignment. I think it's a list of 8 questions that are designed to help you decide if you should be building or buying when it comes to AI. I think that build or buy decision is something that a lot of people that we're talking to right now are struggling with. And I obviously would always love people to pick the build decision because I'm an engineer and it's fun to build things. But the reality is that does not make sense as a solution for a lot of people. And so if you feel like you really just need kind of a objective diagnostic for deciding what to do, what's right for you and your organization, you can scan this QR code. We will also share it, in the follow-up to the webinar. And then if you are sort of not really sure, if you are curious, if you want to talk one-on-one with me, I'm very easy to talk to. I have a public calendar. I'd love for you to just reach out and schedule a few minutes with me. I'm happy to answer your questions and kind of give you some suggestions about which path to go down. And I hope that you will keep in touch with us.